Jill, are we ready? Can I start?
Yes, we're starting now.
Okay. So very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon on new perspectives and opportunities to shift international public finance from fossil fuels to clean energy. And I do hope that you enjoy the London Climate Action Week. My name is Mike Ensgard. I'm head of section for energy, water, and mobility at German International Corporation, GIZ, and I'm based here in Germany. And it will be my pleasure to guide you through our agenda today and moderate the session for the next hour. We will have a very interesting panel today. And before we have the panel, we will have the presentation of from the German Federal Ministry for the Environment and from GIZ. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, to welcome panelists, which I will introduce when we start the panel. And we have the plan to close the session after 1 hour. And I have to tell you that those of you who have had a look at the agenda saw that we were also expecting a speaker from the European Investment Bank, the EIB from Luxembourg. But unfortunately, at a very short notice, they had to cancel their participation. So we'll have 3 panelists who I will introduce to you in due course. But that will give us also the opportunity then to close the session after 1 hour, because some of our panelists have to move on to their next sessions accordingly. I'm not sure, we were missing one speaker. Do we have, can I have some sign if Norbert is now on board? Can somebody give me a signal, please?
I don't think we have him, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Greg. We wanted to start with a word of welcome from the German Federal Ministry for the Environment of Germany. The speaker will be Norbert Gorrissen, who is the Deputy Director General for International Climate Policy. We heard that he has some technical issues joining, so we changed the order a little bit, and we will then start with Greg Mutit, who is the lead author of the study that I mentioned. He is with IASD, and he will share some of the core findings with us today to kick off the session. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mike. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of our study, which we in IASD released a couple of weeks ago, on international public finance, natural gas, and clean alternatives in the Global South. We have 5 main findings, which I'm going to talk you through. Firstly, we find that international public financial institutions have been disproportionately financing gas. Over the last 3 years, gas received more international public finance in low and middle income countries than any other energy source, and 4 times as much as wind or solar. Additional gas is not consistent with the Paris goals, and investments in gas stranded assets, or making it harder to achieve the Paris goals. The good news is that gas is not needed because alternatives are available and affordable for most of its uses. Fourthly, gas is not a good means to provide energy access. And finally, while there are challenges for countries in the Global South to develop clean energy systems, international public finance is very well placed to help countries overcome those challenges. Starting with the first finding, this graph shows you where international public finance for low and middle income countries went 3 years, the annual average. As you can see, gas on the left is by far the largest and 4 times the size of wind or solar. The indication here is that the international public financial institutions, both multilateral development banks and bilateral institutions from G20 governments, have not yet adjusted their lending to be aligned with the Paris goals. That's what our next slide illustrates. So here we see in the blue line at the bottom, the gas usage in the median IPCC scenario consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming. As you can see, gas usage globally falls to about half its level over the next 20 years. Yet on our current trajectory, we're headed towards increasing use of gas. So this is where we need to see a bend in the curve. That pace of decline there is roughly consistent with the pace of decline of production from existing fields. And that's why the International Energy Agency last month included that no new fields need to be developed in a world that heads for 1.5 degrees. This next slide is about the uses of gas. I'm not going to talk you through the details. They're in the report, or you can look at them later. But the big dark blue rectangles there are scaled to the share of different sectors' usage of gas in low and middle income countries. And the light blue vertical lines show when alternatives are expected to be cost competitive with gas. The left-hand line is already cost competitive. As you can see from this graphic, about 2/3 to 3/4 of gas uses have already cost competitive alternative technologies available. So in most of power generation, in much of residential and commercial buildings, some of light industry, and the areas where we're still furthest from having cost competitive alternatives is really in heavy industry at the bottom of the graphic there. One argument that's commonly made in favor of gas is perhaps it can help serve as a partner for renewables by generating power when it isn't windy or isn't sunny. In fact, I think this view is mistaken because it mixes up 2 different ways that gas can be used in the system. If you look at the left-hand green bar there, this relates to combined cycle gas turbine plants, which are only slightly more expensive than renewables on average when they are kept on generating almost all of the time. But that's no use for evening out fluctuations. For that, we need flexible gas technologies such as reciprocating engines or open cycle turbines. That's the right-hand green bar here, which is considerably more expensive than renewable energy. So peaking gas plants to smooth out fluctuations are not a good way to address variability in the system. But the good news here is there are lots of ways that renewables can be integrated into power grids. What you see in this graph is as you move rightwards, the types of technological approaches you need as renewable energy increases its share of generation. And as you move upwards, they increase in cost. Now, in almost all of the countries of the global south, renewable energy penetration is well below 5% of total power generation. And this is readily addressable using just the fairly cheap measures at the bottom left of this graphic. And as renewable penetration increases, of course, costs are coming down very rapidly for many of these technologies, especially battery storage. And experience is growing in particular in northern countries where penetration levels are much higher. I'm going to say a little about the 2 big challenges of energy access, both electricity and clean cooking. Now, both of these are very pressing challenges, in Sustainable Development Goal 7, we aim to deliver universal access in both respects by 2030. However, I would argue gas is not a good solution for delivering these. Of the 800 million people who lack access to electricity, first of all, 85% of them are in rural areas. They are much more, renewable energy, such as wind and solar, is a much better suited way to reach those people. And in particular, it can be applied in a modular way, starting with local generation, building it into integrated national strategies and scaling up. And in most cases, renewable energy is a cheaper way of providing new connections. When we turn to clean cooking, there are still 3 billion people worldwide who rely on traditional biomass with very profound health consequences. This has been perhaps a more persistent problem than electricity access. And the main solution that has been applied to it is liquefied petroleum gases. Now that gas, that's an approach which is fairly light on infrastructure because it's distributed in canisters on the back of trucks. Longer term solutions will require infrastructure, of which there are basically two options, either piped gas or electricity. And I think the important argument here is that money will be saved where it is scarce by building one set of infrastructure rather than two sets. And the costs of electric-based cooking solutions are falling very fast, both with the falling costs of renewables and with improvements in the efficiency of stoves and of cooking devices. So finishing with the challenges that Global South countries face for developing clean energy systems, there is still a need to close the gap on energy access. One of the biggest problems for developing clean energy is the cost of capital, and that's because private investors see renewable energy investments in the South as often risky. There is a need to support integration into grids. The technologies are available, but often grids in the Global South are weak or immature. And there is a need to provide access to technology which might be owned overseas. So with my last slide, I conclude with recommendations for international public financial institutions, both multilateral and bilateral. Firstly, we would call on institutions to end their direct and indirect support to gas, both exploration and production, but also long-lived infrastructure and power plants. We would encourage international public financial institutions to scale up their support for clean energy finance, helping to overcome the challenges I showed you in the previous slide. We would ask institutions to prioritize support to the poorest countries where the challenges are greatest, and finally, to provide support to help enable a just transition. Now, financial institutions are starting to make these changes. Of course, the European Investment Bank, we're also very happy to have a representative of the UK on today's call, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion about how we can spread these solutions more widely. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much for sharing some of the core insights of that very timely study. Congratulations to you and your team for preparing that. I think I'm convinced it comes at the right time where we are in terms of the international climate process. It's a clear analysis, it has clear recommendations, but it's certainly also a very strong challenge to not only energy policies of many countries in the South, but also to the lending policies of international financing institutions, and certainly also to the international gas industry. So we're really looking forward to have also a discussion as part of this webinar, and you all participants have the chance to pose questions in the Q&A box which is provided. So please do already feel free. We will come back and address those questions towards the end of this hour. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Norbert Gorrissen, who is Deputy Director for International Climate Affairs at the German Federal Ministry for the Environment. And as I said in the beginning, the BMU, the German ministry, supported the publication and drafting of this study. So it's a great pleasure, Norbert, to have you with us today. And so the floor is yours to say a few words to our audience today.
Yes, thank you, Mike, and good afternoon and good evening and good morning, colleagues and participants. I'm very sorry that I wasn't able to provide the introductory remarks before Greg introduced the study itself. The order is a little bit strange now. I had technical difficulties, and you may think after 15 months of Corona and 15 months of Zoom conference, one should know how to do that. And actually, it's not my first Zoom conference, but I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. maybe it's because I'm back in office today, and in office the technology is different than at home. So I think Mike already mentioned why we are doing that. I think mainly there's two key reasons. One is the Corona crisis, where we learned that we need to come out of this crisis in a much better, more sustainable, more resilient, and in a greener way. And that the transition to clean energy is absolutely key there, and that economic prosperity can only be achieved, and also long-term resilience, if we directly go towards clean energy. And with clean energy, we mean renewable energies. And secondly, the climate crisis, which is very obvious just these days, whereas we have heavy thunderstorms for almost a week to the south of Germany, with lots of rain. We have heat waves like never been seen before in North America, in particular in Western Canada. And then that makes it very, very obvious we need to act. We need to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degree at least. And the energy sector is a key sector to go there. So renewable energies play a critical role, and can play this critical role there. And in Germany, we are quite successful in expanding renewable energies. We have achieved almost 50% of the electricity production coming from electricity last year, and also in the first half of this year, we have decided to phase out coal. I think I would like to highlight also what G7 have achieved. They committed to reach 1.5 in reach, to go towards net zero by 2050, to phase out fossil fuels, and in particular stop financing of coal. And when it comes to phasing out fossil fuels, the language is a little bit more ambiguous. And I think the key reason for this ambiguity is gas. And when we discuss internally how the energy transition should look like, we have quite an intensive debate about whether gas could play a bridging role or not, and where and how, etc. And against that background, we decided we needed to get more proper analysis, and we are very happy that through GIZ and IISD, this study was prepared and is now presented here in this webinar, that we can have a more nuanced debate on how to deal with the energy transition at the end. And in particular for developing countries, that is absolutely key. I was very happy to see that Greg also presented the case of cooking energy, which is absolutely critical in many developing countries, in particular in Africa. So the simple approach to do everything and quickly and tomorrow on renewable energies is not that easy, and so therefore we have to have a look at that. Thanks for that. Just the last word on Germany. Not everybody may have reached the information. We have agreed last week in our both chambers of the Parliament to amend our climate bill, which means we have a legally binding agreement now that by 2045 Germany will be net zero, and we will reduce our emission reductions by 88% by 2040 and by 65% by 2030. And we have sectoral targets for energy, for industry, for buildings, for industry, and for agriculture, and all those sectors have to contribute. And there is a strict review and monitoring regime around that. And the next government then will have to deal with implementation of appropriate policies and measures to get there. And the question how we deal with gas is one which is relevant both for Germany internally, but also for how we work with abroad countries. And that's why I think this discussion is coming very timely. So I think I stop here and hand over back to you, Mike, and I'm very interested in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norbert, for these kind and encouraging words. And I think we now have plenty of food with both these inputs for our panel discussion as well. And let me just remind all the participants again that we have the Q&A box, so you can already put your questions that you have to the panelists and speakers into the Q&A box, and I've already seen a couple of them popping up. That's great. So let me introduce you to our panel today. We have with us Sandra Guzman. She's founder and general coordinator of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. Sandra, great to have you with us. We also have with us John Merton, who's the COP26 envoy for the United Kingdom. Great, John, that you have the time to be with us this afternoon. And we also have from Denmark, Thomas Anker Christensen, who's the climate ambassador for Denmark. And I would like to start the panel with a question to John. I mean, you're pretty much on the spotlight with being the host of the COP this year in the UK. So what is obviously the question to start with is, how's this agenda we're discussing this afternoon? How relevant is it for the UK? And is the UK taking any commitments or steps to especially look at the public financing side for countries of the South in that regard? John, first, yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks ever so much for having me along. And yes, this is a hugely relevant agenda. I'm the UK's COP26 envoy. I represent our COP president designate, Alok Sharma, around the world as we prepare for the conference in November. But before this, my previous role was as the UK's ambassador to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of the poorest countries in the world and one of the most energy poor countries in the world. And before that, I was in Nairobi in Kenya. And what I found hugely frustrating in those postings was it was easy as a diplomat working on trade issues to access hundreds of millions of pounds for export credits to support an oil or gas project that would take oil and gas from the African continent and use it to export that oil and gas to developed markets around the world. But it was incredibly hard to access export credits or finance for tens of millions of pounds to develop renewables to put power on the ground for African consumers in the poorest African countries. And it was even harder to make sure that you could get that power out into rural areas. And we were reflecting on this as we began our preparations for COP26, and that didn't seem the right way round. If we were encouraging countries around the world to follow what we're doing domestically in reducing our emissions, and we've got a 2050 net zero target, and we've got a commitment to reduce now legally in our law to reduce our emissions by 78% by 2035. If we were encouraging others to follow suit with us, it was no point us making it harder for them by funding the development of fossil fuels overseas through our export credit agencies. So we had an internal debate, and in March, our Prime Minister took a decision, and he announced that the UK from March this year would no longer provide any direct support to fossil fuels in third countries. And that includes all overseas development assistance through what was then DFID and has now become part of the FCDO. That includes all export credits from the UK Export Finance Agency or direct investments from arm's length bodies like the Commonwealth Development Corporation. And it also included all diplomatic support. So you will not now find British ambassadors overseas lobbying for contracts for oil firms or firms working in the hydrocarbon sector, because we've made a policy decision to move away from that. And that enables us to put all our funds overseas and all our energies into supporting the development of renewable energy, clean energy that is not only having a much more positive impact upon our environment, but as Greg just pointed out in his excellent presentation, is actually a sort of energy that creates more jobs and is more accessible to the poorest people in remote communities. And there are a couple of small exceptions to that policy that relate to say humanitarian circumstances where getting power into humanitarian situations, and also some limited exceptions for downstream gas power in the context of an agreed transition pathway, decarbonisation pathway that's 1.5 degrees C aligned with a recipient country. So if there's a country that's already heavily, for example, into coal like South Africa, we have the capacity with that limited exemption to support limited amounts of downstream gas power in order to help that country make a transition to a lower carbon energy system where there's already a transmission grid in place. So we think that policy is world leading. And as I mentioned, it takes a whole of government approach. It's not just our Overseas Development Agency funds, it's not just our export finance, it's all of government. And we really hope that other donors around the world and other providers of export credits will be able to follow us in that policy ahead of COP26. And of course, what that means is now we have more funds available for direct support to renewables. So UK Export Finance have put in place a £2 billion facility to accelerate its support for clean growth. We've doubled our international climate finance to £11.6 billion between 2021 and 2025. And we're part of the G7 £2 billion contribution to the climate investment facilities to support the coal to clean transition that was agreed at the G7. So it's an exciting area, and we now, we've worked hard to align what we say with what we do, or what we do with what we say, and we hope that other countries will join us in that in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for illustrating that type of leadership that the UK is showing here as host of the COP and beyond. And the same question goes to our next speaker, Thomas Anker Christensen, Climate Ambassador of Denmark. Denmark has been over the last 20 years a leader in renewables, also thanks to your very rich endowment with renewable energy sources and a lot of wind in the country, but also you've shown a lot of leadership internationally. So it would also be very interesting, Thomas, to hear from you how you now look at the gas issue from the Danish side, and what impact that will have on your international engagement.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, and also for the great presentation by Greg of the report. We are going basically at this challenge from a different angle than our British neighbors. We started in a way looking at our own domestic situation last year, and that came with the Danish climate law, our 70% emission reduction target for 2030. We decided in one go to ramp up dramatically green energy production in Denmark from offshore wind based in the North Sea, and at the same time set an end date to production and extraction of oil and gas from the North Sea. So we are in a way changing the North Sea from being an oil and gas reservoir for us to being a clean green energy reservoir. Two decisions within a time span of a few months. One, setting the ambitious target of setting up offshore wind, which will lead to an offshore wind capacity that is almost double our current demand, which will enable us to export green energy to our neighbors and produce green hydrogen for decarbonizing the heavy sectors and transport. And at the same time, setting an end date for production of gas and oil, basically with the decision to have no new licensing rounds for oil and gas on our territory. The end date isn't fixed. It will happen before, 2050, when we need to be climate neutral. But basically, the licenses that are currently there will run out, and within a few years, no one will invest in new equipment because there's no licensing to continue the production and the extraction. So that will basically end the production and the extraction well before 2050. As a part of the political decision to do this was then also the decision by Parliament to ask the government to set in motion a global initiative, an alliance, to drive end of production and extraction around the world. So we are in the process of setting up an alliance that will try to work with governments around the world to set end dates for their production and extraction of oil and gas, in a way to step off the gas, as you are calling it. And that's very much a supply side initiative. But obviously, and that then goes to the UK's decision, we are now also looking at ending public finance for fossils overseas. We took the decision already to end all financing of coal, both through export credits, financing through ODA and other sources, also through the multilateral development banks. And we are now having a hard look at oil and gas. And personally, I do hope that we will be able to make announcements on this by the time of Glasgow. At least it's something that's being worked hard on in the government. In addition to this, we are then also taking that policy line to the MDBs and are pushing hard now for multilateral development banks to end support for fossil investments, coal, oil, and gas. Gas is definitely, as also was in Greg's presentation, the most difficult topic, and one where we're having difficult decisions also with the poorest countries and the recipients of the investments, those who invest also into gas for clean cooking and for energy access. And that leads me to my final point, is that we are also redirecting our investments into renewables and into renewables in the poorest countries. And for Glasgow to be a success, I think that we as a donor community, UK, Germany, Denmark, and others, we need to really establish a pipeline of alternatives to the fossil investments in the poorest countries, because we cannot turn off the gas pipe without turning on the renewables pipeline. Then we leave people with no alternatives, and that is not equitable. It's not fair, and in a way, we have to show in real practice that the lower price and the availability of renewable energy, that is part of the argument for why the fossil assets will be stranded. Well, that's also an economic reality, a social reality for all those people who are in need of energy access around the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We'll come back to you. So we hear, I guess, a lot of alignment. We have heard from 3 governments now, 3 European governments, Denmark, UK, and Germany. And when I hear you speak, I hear a lot of alignment in terms of the way forward and the commitment when it comes to getting out of fossils, but also getting off the gas. But at the same time, we heard from the study the status quo, the reality that much more funding is 4 times, I guess I remember now, of funding goes into fossil infrastructure in the global south through public and international financial institutions. So there's obviously a tension, and I would like to invite now Sandra Guzman, give us not only a civil society perspective, but I'm sure you would also be in a good position to put that in the context of the region you specialize on, Latin America and the Caribbean, a region where a lot of gas has been found and is currently under development. So I guess that some of the governments in Latin America have also a very particular perspective on that opportunity that they have in front of them. So Sandra, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this important conversation. And congratulations for the report, because it's very useful to show the reality that we are facing and the urgency to decarbonize investments if we really want to tackle climate change in an appropriate way. There is no doubt that a big success of the fossil fuel industry was to sell the idea that gas was a transition resource because it is less pollutant than coal. And this idea, as the report commented, has been there since the 80s, so it has been around for a while now. And people and governments believed it, and they adopted policies around this. But gas is still a fossil fuel, and it's still an industry that requires a heavy amount of money to survive. And each dollar invested in gas today will last for the next 50 years or more. So gas was never meant to be a transitional resource, and we have to discuss about that. So according to the report, gas projects received nearly 60 billion in international public finance per year between 2017 and 2019. And obviously we believed that in the context of the pandemic, this trajectory would change, but no. As the report shows, 75% of the MPV's investments supported gas in last year, to 2020. And this is showing that investments on gas are 4 times bigger than those investments for wind and solar energy. And these numbers matched a lot with what we have been analyzing in the context of Latin America. At the beginning of this year, we published the Sustainable Finance Index, which is a tool that tracks how much money are Latin American countries receiving from sustainable sources. and how much money are the Latin American countries receiving from these carbon intensive sources. But we also analyze how much the countries are investing through their public budget in sustainable matters, and particularly how much are they investing in carbon intensive activities, particularly in investments in gas and oil. And we applied this index in the 21 major emitters in the region. And we found out that the carbon intensive income that the countries are bringing primarily from gas and oil licenses and permits is 196 times more income from those that we received to tackle climate change from bilateral and multilateral mechanisms. This is 196 times more of the money that the countries have to tackle climate change from the GCF, the bilateral cooperation, or any other source to tackle climate change. So this at the same time is putting a lot of pressure in governments to keep producing fossil fuels because there is a huge demand. And we analyzed that these 21 countries allocated 150 times more public budget to the production of gas and oil than those resources that they are allocating for renewable energy or energy efficiency, for instance. So there is a clear carbon lock-in in these countries. And we found that these 21 countries rely in a way or the other in fossil fuels to sustain their economies. In this sense, of course, international and national public finance are far from the alignment to the Paris Agreement. And this is the key point. If we really want to tackle climate change, we have to cut the finance on gas, not only coal and oil, of course, but particularly gas. And this is why this agenda is very important. This is why this report is very important, because I think it is time to start talking about transformative finance in developing countries and think about how we are going to diversify those revenue sources to generate new type of industries, new type of jobs, and of course, more money to sustain our economies and decouple these economies from fossil fuels. So I think that's why this report is so important and timely in this moment.
Sandra, thank you very much. And when listening to you, I'm starting to wonder why when a new gas field is discovered, you usually have a price tag on how much a country can benefit from it. You find very few systematic price tags about how much money could be made from wind, solar, and other renewable resources. So probably it's also a task to really quantify much more what is economically in for countries that have rich renewable energy resources. Before we come to the Q&A, and I would again like to remind our participants that we have that Q&A box, which you can feed with your questions that you want to, or also comments certainly that you have to the debate. I would like to come back to our three panelists and sort of seek their recommendations and advice in terms of what needs to be done on the international agenda to really push the renewables. I think it's very obvious that we're going to need globally a massive buildup of renewable energy infrastructure and technologies over the next decades to come. And when I look at it, and Thomas, I know you've also worked intensively in the context of the United Nations in different programs and in different processes, you probably be in a good position to give a response, but also to the other panelists. What needs to be done to really make a encourage a dramatic shift, not just away from fossils, but really a shift into supporting countries of the South to systematically develop these renewable energy resources that provide the alternative to the gas that we don't really want to see blown up or burned and going into the atmosphere. John, Thomas, Sandra, anyone who likes to start is invited.
Should I go first?
Yes, if you can, it'd be great.
Well, this is of course the $100,000 question, and not an easy one to answer, because it takes, in a way, reform, or some would say a revolution, of both the financial system and the way it operates. It's very fossil dependent, even the rules around how stock exchanges work, financial streams, what is considered a credit-worthy investment, what gets a AAA rating, which then decides on the cost of the capital. I mean, it's all tied into a fossil industry, and there are many things that even in terms of that sort of financial system levers that need to change. And in Europe, the European taxonomy is our answer to some of that. In the US, they're working on different paths, and in Asia, they're taking other directions. The way large companies report to their shareholders is another example. There are currently more than 200 different standards on how you report on economic, social, governance questions, and some kind of streamlining, some kind of standardization needs to happen in order for there to be transparency and accountability in the private sector. And then amongst governments, well, we have not been focused on asking the multilateral development banks, the MDBs, to really put their shoulder to the wheel of ramping up renewables. And I think the figures mentioned by Sandra show that. Still billions and billions going into fossil investments. And for example, the World Bank in their program to support countries with their nationally determined contributions, their climate plans, only has had a program for 15 countries. We're 5 or 6 years after Paris, and it's only 15 countries that get focused support from the bank and even doing the planning, not to talk about setting up the pipeline. So, I mean, the MDBs should give all governments support. They should commit themselves with targets and benchmarks to the kind of funding they give. They should look at bringing in all instruments, including guarantees, to the space. They should have dedicated capacity to ramp up pipelines of renewables and to bring in public and private investors and really make this their number one priority, as we have done in Europe with the European Investment Bank. This is the way we think all the MDBs should operate. And then we, as countries, we can help giving technical assistance, capacity building. For us, bilaterally, as Denmark, the Danish Energy Agency is involved in now soon 21 countries around the world, giving capacity building to how you operate renewable energy at scale. When you have 100% of your energy from renewables, many countries think that can be done, and that your system, electricity power system, will break down. That's not true. We are doing it on a daily basis almost from wind, but the engineering knowledge and skills that are needed to do so need to be taught, and many countries don't have that knowledge and that insight. And we're trying to do it bilaterally, but that could be done much more systematically through IRENA, the IEA, global institutions, and just one small country doing it on a bilateral government-to-government basis. I could talk much longer about, but these are just some examples.
Thank you, Thomas. That's great. And I would also like to alert you to one of the comments that we have in the Q&A section from Ute Kochi, who refers to one of the examples of World Bank lending to Guyana. It's unfortunate we don't have any representative of the World Bank to respond to that, but it certainly shows that there's a larger issue that also reflects the let's say client orientation that many of the multilateral development banks have, and they get the request from their countries. So it's certainly not an easy task for them to balance that. But John, I would also like to give the word to you and also link that to a question we have here from Larry Vanderberg. Long question, I won't read it all, but basically she's asking what is the ambition of the UK hosting the COP26 to, let's say, drag other countries along the path that you've described in terms of the phasing out of support for fossil fuel investments. And do you aim at a particular outcome in Glasgow in that regard?
Thanks so much. So the first thing I'd say is this trend is happening anyway, both in the private sector and the public sector. And that becomes particularly apparent if you look at flows rather than stock. Yes, the global stock of hydrocarbon generation is much higher than the stock of renewables. But last year, BNEF have demonstrated that 90% of global capacity additions in the energy sector were wind or solar. and that we can anticipate to continue and accelerate, and that will progressively remove demand for coal and gas in the energy sector. Demand for oil is primarily driven by vehicles, but you're seeing more and more countries like my own setting dates after which it will no longer be legal to sell internal combustion engines, and in the UK that's 2030, after which you will not be able to sell an internal combustion engine vehicle, and that will reduce demand for oil. And we're seeing the automotive manufacturers sort of setting dates by which they will stop selling internal combustion engines, which are ahead of some national targets. But we need to, you're also seeing this reflected in company share prices. That, you know, the most valuable energy company in the world is no longer an oil major like Exxon or Chevron. It's a Florida-based renewable energy producer called NextEra Energy. The most valuable automotive manufacturer in the world is Tesla. So this is happening. We just need to accelerate it in all the ways that Thomas has spoken of, removing the barriers to technological adaptation, removing export subsidies that we've talked about, and also domestic subsidies that many producer countries have for fossil fuels. Focusing a lot on ideas like embedded generation is going to be really important. President Ramaphosa did a really important thing the other day when he announced a lifting of the limit for embedded generation from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatt. If you can generate solar power on site for almost the same cost as it costs to send electricity down a wire in a country, which is true in many cases, solar will always outcompete any fossil fuel generation. And also freeing up markets to investors. There are many economies where you've got a large dominant power producer, and it's not possible for other entrants to come into that market, and that slows the adoption of renewable energy resources. In terms of what we're doing to drag everyone along with us, we're working very hard through our diplomacy. All of our ambassadors around the world have got objectives relating to COP26 and to climate and this agenda. My friends like Thomas and Norbert are probably fed up of me pushing them and others to follow suit with what we've done on fossil fuels. If you look at the G7 committed to end immediately this year support for coal power overseas, which is something we did a couple of years ago in the UK, but the rest of the G7 have joined forces, which means there's only one country now in the world that's significantly financing coal overseas. And also the G7 communique in Carbis Bay committed to, and I've put the answer in the chat somewhere, committed countries to phase out new direct government support for international carbon intensive fossil fuel energy as soon as possible, with limiting exceptions consistent with the 1.5 degree goal and best available science. So we're making progress in our diplomacy, and we hope that we'll bring more fruit to bear by the time we get to COP26.
Thank you, John. I just had another look at the chat. There are a couple of questions addressing the issue of big and the small. The fact that we come traditionally from a power sector that was defined and characterized by large investment projects, big transmission line, big power stations, and we're moving with renewables, at least to a very substantive degree, much more decentralized forms of energy services, and also with that to much smaller, more granular investments that also, I know that pose a challenge to many bankers, and especially also development bankers. So maybe Sandra, in your statement, you can also reflect on especially how you see that in Latin America shaping, because we know that there are also a number of public firms, public companies that come from a tradition of putting very big investments in individual projects, and how they might be struggling with that new reality of renewables.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike. Well, one important thing is, as the report says, it is important that developing countries, for instance, stop emitting permits and licenses to produce gas and fossil fuels. But they also need alternatives to sustain their economies. And in this point, I think the international financial support should go to create the right conditions and the capacities, but also there is a need of technology transfer, as well as it is important to support developing countries in create their national industries on renewable energy. How can we create the capacity to generate their own technologies? And as you know, the lack of access to patents it's a big issue in developing countries, because they have to rely on foreign technology when they should have the conditions also to create new industries on renewable energy at the national level to create all these jobs and all these advantages for their economies. And of course, this is a key issue. The energy transition needs to be fair and needs to be just. And we don't have to think in the energy transition only at the big scale. We have to start promoting a lot the decentralization of the power generation to support local states, communities, cities, and to really start focusing and transferring international financial support to develop all these transitions at the local level. Greg was mentioning that the electricity the access to electricity is not such a big issue, but it is. In many Latin American countries, Africa and Asia, there are millions of people that live without electricity. And obviously the access to renewable energy at the local level is a major element to then promote proper development schemes. So in this sense, we also have to create more incentives and there should be more international support to create more energy efficiency programs, because I think energy transition is not only the substitution of combined cycle technologies for wind power stations. It's not just the change in the technology, but rather it is about reducing the consumption of electricity, the demand, and then help the renewable energy to satisfy that controlled demand. So we have to reduce the consumption and then leave the renewable energy to participate in a fair way. Otherwise, we will end up repeating the same mistake, no? Relying on technology change instead of when what we really need is change in the consumption of behavior. Because if we just are demanding a lot of electricity, we will end up like putting thousands of solar panels, thousands of wind power stations. And obviously that also has an impact in the environment. So if the very last goal is to reduce emissions and to make a balance in terms of our living with nature, the solution is not only a change in the technology, but it's actually changing the actual model and how we implement that technology in collaboration with local actors, in collaboration with all of these local economies to really transform the system from the bottom and not from the top.
Right. Thank you very much, Sandra, for this perspective. And I have a kind offer here from John to add an African perspective on the issue of the scale. But also, John, maybe you could say a few words. You said you talked about the role of your ambassadors now worldwide to really drag other governments along. And I would be very curious to understand what are they telling African governments that have over the last couple of years discovered gas resources and see them as a way out of poverty and chance for economic development. What is the kind of dialogue you're having with them, the arguments you're exchanging there?
Thanks. So just on the issue of scale, I think this is one of the huge advantages of renewables. If I take the nuclear plant that the UK is building at the moment, Hinkley C, that's got a capacity of 3.2 gigawatts. The entire installed capacity of the Kenyan national grid, which is the 6th largest economy, I think, in Africa, is 2.6 gigawatts. And what that means is you can't put big power stations onto some of these national grids easily. You can't put 500 megawatt power stations on easily, which is the sort of scale that a lot of fossil fuels operates at commercially. Whereas, as you've pointed out, the scalability of renewables is such that the unit cost of a solar power station that's 5 megawatts is not substantially different than a much larger one. And they're also very easily sort of located at weak spots in the grid. So you can, in my experience in Kenya, if you've got a couple of weak patches in the grid, you can put in a small solar farm of 1-2 megawatts and you can help fill grids in a really helpful way at different voltages. So they are very helpful. And of course, then we haven't even mentioned mini grids. And if you go countries like DRC, where it was most recently and where the national transmission infrastructure has essentially broken down, then renewable energy mini grids are fantastic ways to get power into rural areas with limited communications and transport and so on. So they're incredibly helpful. Now, in terms of our of our conversations that we're having in terms of countries who are seeking to develop oil and gas reserves at the moment, and where UK export finance won't be available, I would point you back to the graph that Greg showed and the slide that he showed early on in his presentation, which shows that there's still, even today, 4 times more international finance going into public finance going into fossil fuels, into gas, and into solar and wind. And I think that's, there's no shortage at the moment of finance. The shortage that we're finding is from countries who want to put in renewable energy capacity and who are finding it difficult to access the finance. And so hopefully the switch that we have made will help those countries to develop their renewable energy capacity, whilst also avoiding the risks that have been highlighted and highlighted by others in other contexts about the risk of locking into stranded assets, taking on a lot of debt to develop a hydrocarbon sector that actually in a few years' time becomes a stranded asset as it's no longer to produce because competitively in a market where actually demand for hydrocarbons will be falling. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John, for this perspective. And we're coming to the end of this very interesting and intense hour. It's been great spending these 60 minutes with all you guys, but also with all our participants who have joined from around the world. Thank you very much for your questions. I know that some of them have already been answered in writing. We will also look at them carefully after the session again, those that have not been answered, because I think this is an emerging agenda, especially on gas. I mean, we've talked about renewables for a long time. We talked about coal over the last couple of years very intensively, but I think the gas is really something that is moving to the centrality of the climate talks over the next couple of months and years. And I think this is only a start of a conversation, and this is an excellent study that IISD has produced. So thank you to the colleagues, to the team that put together this study under Greg's astute leadership. Thanks to BMU for making it possible, for providing also the financial, but also the, let's say, political backing to look into a subject that is obviously also critical, because there are a lot of existing policies that are challenged. There's a lot of vested interest also involved, and that in a time when also the world has been struggling with a very with another very important pressing issue over the last 1.5 years. But we have the COP ahead of us. We wish John, you and your colleagues all the luck that you need to prepare well. The world is dependent on your hard work, but also on the contributions of all the other parties that will come to Glasgow or join virtually. So thank you very much, all of you, and I wish you remaining good, afternoon if you're also in Europe like I'm, or any other part of the day, wherever you from wherever you're connected. And I hope to see you all again in follow-up conversations. And thanks to our panelists in particular. Bye-bye. All the best to you.
Thank you. Bye.